What if you have no phone, no grocery store, no warm bed, no plumbing, just you, the wild, and roughly 12,000 things actively trying to kill you? Welcome to being a human for 99% of our species' existence. And here's the thing, we survive. Not just barely, not like, oh, we scraped by with 3 guys left. We thrived. We spread across every continent, adapted to literal deserts and frozen tundras, and figured out solutions to problems so insane that modern scientists look back and go, wait, that actually worked? Today we're diving into the wildest, most creative, most absolutely unhinged survival methods ancient humans used and that genuinely scientifically worked. Some of these will make you feel like a genius just for understanding them. Others will make you deeply uncomfortable. All of them will make you respect your ancestors on a completely new level. And before we start, I want you to keep one thing in mind throughout this entire video. These people had no books, no internet, no labs. Every single thing they discovered by trying it on themselves and seeing if they died. That's the bar. That was the scientific method for most of human history. Try it. Survive. Tell your friends. Let's go. Drinking urine. Yes, we're starting here. Let's get the obvious one out of the way because I know you were thinking about it. Ancient humans drank urine. Multiple cultures across multiple continents documented this practice, and before you close this video in disgust, here's what you need to understand. They weren't completely wrong. Fresh urine is about 95% water. It's sterile when it leaves the body. In a genuine survival situation where you have zero access to clean water, drinking your own urine once, maybe twice, can buy you critical hours. Ancient Roman soldiers reportedly used urine to disinfect wounds on the battlefield. Egyptian medical papyri from 1550 BCE reference urine as a diagnostic tool and treatment. Urine therapy pops up in Ayurvedic texts, in ancient Chinese medicine, in indigenous practices across Africa and the Americas. Now, and this is important, modern survival experts will tell you not to drink urine as a long-term strategy because after the first time, the concentration of salts and waste products increases, and you're essentially accelerating your own dehydration. So your ancestors weren't perfect on this one, but the initial instinct, not completely insane. The Romans also gargled with urine to whiten their teeth. Portuguese sailors apparently used it to wash their hands to prevent infections during long voyages. Ammonia is a legitimate cleaning agent, so chemically speaking, they weren't wrong there either. The Romans in particular were obsessed with urine to a degree that should be studied by psychologists. There were literal public urine collection pots on Roman street corners. People paid to collect it. There was a urine tax. Emperor Vespasian introduced it, and when his son complained it was undignified, Vespasian held a coin up to his face and said the famous line, "Money doesn't smell." That phrase exists today because of a urine tax. You learned something. Moving on before I lose you completely. Maggot therapy. Medieval doctors were onto something horrifying. Picture yourself as a wounded soldier in ancient times. You've got a deep infected wound. It's festering. It's turning colors that wounds should not turn. You're probably going to lose the limb, if not your life. And then some guy looks at you and says, "Good news, I've got exactly what you need," and shows you a jar full of maggots. This is not a horror movie. This is medicine. Maggot debridement therapy, the deliberate placement of fly larvae onto infected wounds, was practiced by indigenous Australians, Mayan healers in Central America, and various battlefield surgeons throughout history. The logic was observed empirically. Wounds that maggots got into often healed better than wounds that didn't. At some point, some brilliant and apparently fearless person decided to stop seeing this as a problem and start seeing it as a solution. The science behind it is genuinely remarkable. Maggots of specific fly species, particularly the greenbottle blowfly, enzymes that break down dead and infected tissue while leaving healthy tissue completely intact. They physically eat bacteria. They release compounds that actually stimulate healing and new tissue growth. They're essentially tiny biological scalpels that operate 24 hours a day for free, don't require anesthesia, and never send you a bill. Civil War surgeons in the United States noticed that soldiers whose wounds had been colonized by maggots during the chaos of battle often had better outcomes than soldiers whose wounds had been kept clean and bandaged. They started applying maggots deliberately. It worked. Modern medicine fully rediscovered this in the 20th century. Maggot therapy is an FDA-approved medical treatment today. Hospitals in the US, UK, and Europe use it for diabetic ulcers, pressure sores, and wounds that antibiotics can't touch, including infections caused by antibiotic-resistant bacteria like MRSA, which is one of the most dangerous pathogens in modern hospitals. Tiny maggots, eating MRSA. Ancient healers figured this out thousands of years ago, not because they understood enzymes or microbiology, but because they watched, they noticed, and they were willing to do deeply weird things in service of keeping people alive. Honestly, respect. Let's talk about the Inca Empire for a second, because these people were doing things that seem medically impossible with zero modern technology. High in the Andes Mountains, Inca healers and surgeons performed a procedure that essentially involved deliberately cooling patients to reduce pain and inflammation before performing surgery. By exposing patients to cold mountain air, cold water, and in some cases packing the area around a wound in snow, they were able to reduce circulation to the wound site, numb pain through cold, and slow biological processes enough to operate on someone who wasn't screaming and thrashing. This is therapeutic hypothermia. It's a completely real and well-established medical technique. Modern hospitals use it during cardiac surgery, after cardiac arrests, and during certain brain surgeries to protect tissue from damage. The principle is elegant. Cold slows everything down, including cell death. Less cell death during surgery means better outcomes. The Inca didn't have that explanation, but they had the result, and the result was what mattered. But here's what makes the Inca version even more impressive. They were performing trepanation. That's the practice of literally drilling holes in people's skulls, surgically, on purpose. And they were doing it with a survival rate that modern anthropologists, when they examined hundreds of ancient skulls recovered from Inca sites, estimated at around 90% in the later Inca period. 90% for brain surgery, in the mountains, with stone tools and cold air for anesthesia. For context, skull surgery in 17th century Europe, which considered itself the pinnacle of civilization, had a survival rate closer to 10%. The Inca were performing brain surgery 9 times better than Europeans who had metal instruments, universities, and the complete works of ancient Greek medicine available to them. They used cold. They understood infection control through cleanliness in ways European surgeons of the same era absolutely did not. They kept refining the technique over generations, and the skulls show it. Earlier skulls have lower survival rates, later ones are dramatically higher. They were iterating, they were improving, they were doing science. They just called it something else. Here's one that has genuinely confused anthropologists for decades: the widespread ancient practice of intentionally eating clay. This is called geophagy, and it shows up absolutely everywhere. Greek physicians wrote about it. Romans did it. It's documented in indigenous cultures across sub-Saharan Africa. Pregnant women in many traditional societies across the world actively sought out specific types of clay to eat as part of their regular diet. And for the longest time, Western scientists thought this was just a bizarre cultural quirk, a nutritional deficiency response gone wrong, or maybe just a very weird thing humans do sometimes. Then they actually studied the clay, and then they had to do a lot of apologizing. Specific types of clay, particularly kaolin clay and certain mineral-rich earthen deposits, they bind to toxins in the digestive system and prevent those toxins from being absorbed into the bloodstream. They soothe intestinal inflammation. They contain significant bioavailable amounts of iron and magnesium, exactly the minerals that pregnant women need in dramatically higher quantities during gestation. The clay cravings that showed up universally in traditional pregnant women weren't random. They were the body correctly identifying a nutritional resource. In traditional societies where food sources were unreliable and plant-based diets frequently involved exposure to naturally occurring toxins, because a huge number of edible roots and tubers contain chemical defenses, eating specific clays with meals was essentially a pharmaceutical intervention. The clay neutralized the toxins before they could cause harm. It was edible medicine. Native Californian groups specifically mixed clay with acorns, which are loaded with bitter, toxic tannins, to make them edible and nutritious. The Quechua people of the Andes ate clay alongside wild bitter potatoes that without clay would cause severe gastrointestinal poisoning. Without the clay, the food was dangerous. With the clay, the food was safe and nourishing. Entire populations were sustained on food sources that would have been inedible without this knowledge. These people didn't have chemistry degrees, but they figured out across generations that if you eat this specific dirt with this specific food, you don't get sick. And they passed that information down through culture and tradition, and they were right. That's not superstition. That's empirical science conducted over hundreds of generations, written in the survival of their children and grandchildren and us. Still in South America, because honestly, these people were just built different. Anyone who has spent time at high altitude knows about altitude sickness, the headaches that feel like your skull is being squeezed in a vice, the fatigue that makes walking feel like swimming, difficulty breathing, cognitive fog, nausea. At extreme altitudes, it progresses to conditions that can kill you within days. The Andes contains some of the highest continuously inhabited terrain on Earth, with historical cities sitting above 3,000 meters and agricultural terraces climbing even higher than that. The Inca and their predecessors solved altitude sickness with coca leaves, and they did it so effectively that an empire was built on high-altitude agriculture and mining that would have been physically impossible without this single plant. Now, before your brain immediately jumps to cocaine, coca leaves are the plant that cocaine is eventually derived from. Yes, but chewing whole coca leaves is nothing remotely like using cocaine. The alkaloid content in whole leaves is low and slow-releasing. The effects are gradual and mild, and for thousands of years this practice was entirely medicinal, agricultural, and deeply integrated into Andean culture and ceremony. Chewing coca leaves measurably increases oxygen uptake efficiency in the blood. It provides steady, mild stimulation that suppresses altitude-induced fatigue without the crash you get from stimulants. It suppresses the appetite when you are doing hard physical labor at altitude where your caloric needs skyrocket, but the altitude itself destroys your desire to eat. It genuinely, pharmacologically prevents altitude sickness in ways that are now documented in medical literature. Andean miners working deep in high-altitude silver mines chewed coca leaves to work shifts that would have been physiologically impossible for unacclimatized workers. When Spanish colonizers arrived, they initially tried to suppress the practice because they associated it with indigenous religion and wanted to break cultural continuity. Their workforce immediately became sick and unproductive. The colonizers reversed the ban within years, not out of any ethical consideration for indigenous culture, obviously, but because the coca leaves were the only thing keeping their forced labor workforce alive and functional enough to extract silver. Modern mountaineers and trekkers acclimatizing in the Andes are still offered coca tea at their hotels in Cusco. It works. The pharmacology is real, documented in peer-reviewed research, and your ancestors figured it out while looking at a bush and deciding to chew it. Let's talk about something that goes even deeper than individual plants: the entire concept of the ancient global herbal pharmacy. For a long time, Western medicine dismissed traditional herbal remedies as superstition, witch doctor stuff, the placebo effect and wishful thinking, and people who didn't know any better. And then actual pharmacology started systematically testing these things, and the results have been consistently, repeatedly, professionally humbling. Willow bark tea was used for fever and pain relief in ancient Sumer, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and independently in indigenous cultures across Europe and the Americas. Nobody shared notes across these civilizations. They all arrived at the same plant through the same method. Try it. Survive. Tell your friend. The active compound in willow bark is salicin. The human body metabolizes salicin into salicylic acid. Aspirin is acetyl salicylic acid, a synthetic, slightly modified, stomach-friendlier version of the exact same molecule. Every time you have taken aspirin for a headache, a fever, or a hangover, you have taken ancient Sumerian medicine with a lab coat on it. Foxglove was used in Welsh and broader medieval European folk medicine to treat what healers described as dropsy, swelling caused by heart failure. The active compounds are called cardiac glycosides, specifically digitalis, still used in modern cardiac medicine today for heart failure and arrhythmias. Your cardiologist is prescribing a medieval herb. Pacific yew bark was used by indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. The active compound is paclitaxel, now sold under the brand name Taxol, and it is one of the most important and widely used chemotherapy drugs in modern cancer treatment, saving lives in oncology wards right now. Ancient knowledge. Quinine, derived from cinchona bark used by Andean peoples to treat fevers, became the first effective treatment for malaria in the Western world and saved millions of lives across the colonial era and beyond. Tonic water, the thing you mix with gin, contains quinine. You are drinking ancient Andean fever medicine at your next dinner party. The pattern is relentless, and it keeps going. The global pharmaceutical industry now formally acknowledges that roughly 25% of all modern drugs are directly derived from or structurally inspired by compounds first identified in traditional medicine. A quarter of your medicine cabinet has roots that go back thousands of years to people who were dismissed as primitive. The dismissal was always the problem. The medicine was always real. Back in the days, there was also an agricultural hack that shaped entire continents. For at least 60,000 years, and possibly significantly longer, indigenous Australians practiced what is now called cultural burning, or fire stick farming. The practice involved deliberately setting controlled fires to burn sections of land in carefully managed rotational patterns, coordinated across vast territories, timed to seasons, and refined over thousands of generations of observation. This sounds on the surface like destruction, but the actual ecological effects were the precise opposite of destruction. Controlled burning at the right frequency and intensity cleared the dense underbrush that accumulates in older vegetation, preventing the catastrophic, uncontrollable megafires that occur when decades of fuel load build up unchecked. It stimulated the growth of specific food plants, grasses, tubers, fruiting shrubs that thrive and proliferate in the rich, open, post-fire environment. It created habitat edges that attracted game animals. It managed an entire continent the way a modern farmer manages a field, except the field was bigger than Western Europe. When European colonizers arrived in Australia in the 18th century and described the landscape as wild and untouched wilderness, they were looking at the result of 60,000 years of continuous, sophisticated land management and completely failing to recognize it for what it was. The open, park-like landscapes they walked through weren't natural. They were maintained. The whole continent had been continuously, intelligently gardened by human hands for longer than any civilization in human history. When colonizers disrupted indigenous burning practices through dispossession, restriction of movement, and outright prohibition, the Australian bush began accumulating fuel load at a rate it had never experienced in living memory. Decades passed. The fuel built up, and then came the fire. The catastrophic 2019 to 2020 Australian bushfire season burned approximately 18 million hectares, killed an estimated 3 billion animals, and blanketed cities in smoke for months. Climate change made it worse, but ecologists and fire management experts are explicit that the abandonment of traditional burning practices over 2 centuries dramatically increased fuel loads to levels that made catastrophic fire not just possible, but inevitable. Modern Australian fire management is now actively reintegrating traditional burning knowledge. Indigenous rangers are employed and consulted to reintroduce controlled burning to landscapes that have been dangerously neglected for 200 years. The ancient method, dismissed, nearly lost, is literally being recovered from the wreckage of dismissing it. The lesson cost 18 million hectares to learn. Now we have to talk about Polynesian navigation. The Polynesian peoples navigated the open Pacific Ocean, the largest, emptiest, most featureless body of water on the planet, in wooden outrigger canoes without compasses, without sextants, without charts, without any instrument that modern sailors would consider remotely adequate for open ocean navigation. And they didn't just cross it once, accidentally, and happen to land somewhere. They systematically explored and deliberately colonized essentially every habitable island across the entire Pacific over several thousand years, covering an ocean that contains more than half the planet's surface area. Hawaii, New Zealand, Easter Island, Fiji, Tonga, Tahiti, all of them settled intentionally by people in canoes, navigating by methods that took decades to master. They used stars, and that part, while extraordinary in its memorized detail, is at least comprehensible. A mental map of the night sky as a fixed compass. Knowing which star rises above which island, at which time of year, at which angle above the horizon. What is genuinely almost incomprehensible is the wave reading. Pacific navigators learned to read deep ocean swell patterns, long period swells generated by distant weather systems thousands of miles away, which travel across the ocean in consistent directions and refract around islands in predictable, detectable ways. A trained navigator could feel the motion of the canoe, the subtle changes in how the hull moved and pitched, and determine their position and heading from pure physical sensation. When visibility was poor and stars weren't visible, they navigated entirely by feel. Some navigators reportedly laid down in the hull of the canoe specifically to better sense the swells through their body. They also tracked bird behavior. Specific seabirds fly out from land at dawn and return at dusk, giving bearing and distance to unseen islands. They read cloud formations, which tend to form and persist above islands even in clear weather. They watched changes in water color, temperature, and the presence of specific floating debris. They had a complete, integrated, multi-sensory system for finding invisible specks of land in the largest ocean on Earth. This knowledge was not written down. It was encoded in chants, in songs, in oral traditions, and passed from master navigators to selected apprentices through years of physical training that began in childhood. When colonization disrupted these traditions in the 19th and 20th centuries, much of this knowledge nearly disappeared entirely. The revival of traditional Polynesian navigation, led by the Polynesian Voyaging Society and the voyages of the canoe Hakulea beginning in the 1970s, represents one of the most remarkable acts of cultural recovery in modern history. These people didn't survive the Pacific despite having no technology. They built a technology out of pure, accumulated, embodied human attention, refined across 1,000 years of oceanic travel. Modern oceanographers and astrophysicists who have studied their methods describe them, without exaggeration, as extraordinary. Let's close with something that every single person reading this has benefited from, probably today, and almost certainly doesn't think about in these terms. Fermentation was almost certainly inadvertently discovered by accident. Rotting fruit, waterlogged grain, milk left in a warm place, and then observed, replicated, and refined into one of the most powerful and versatile survival technologies in human history. We mean survival in the absolute most literal. In a world without refrigeration, without canning, without preservatives, fresh food spoiled within days, fermentation extended the edible life of food from days to months to years. It was the difference between eating in winter and starving in winter. But that's just the beginning. Here's what often gets missed in the romantic story of ancient beer and cheese. In most of human history, in most inhabited places, clean water was not reliably available. Water sources near human settlements were contaminated with human and animal waste, with bacteria that caused dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and a dozen other diseases that killed millions of people every year well into the 19th century. In this world, mildly alcoholic fermented beverages, beer, wine, and grain drinks were not luxuries. They were safe hydration. The alcohol and acidity created environments hostile to the pathogens that turned water into a death sentence. Ancient Egyptian laborers, including those who built the pyramids, received daily beer rations, not as a perk, as part of a caloric and hydration strategy that kept a workforce alive and functional in a hot environment with unreliable water. Several European monks and peasants drank beer throughout the day, including children, in quantities that would alarm a modern observer, specifically because the water supply around population centers was actively dangerous. The brewing process, boiling the water as part of grain mashing, killed the pathogens. The fermentation killed anything that survived. And then there's the nutritional dimension. Fermentation doesn't just preserve food, it transforms it. It breaks down anti-nutritional compounds that interfere with mineral absorption. It synthesizes B vitamins. It increases the bioavailability of proteins and minerals. It makes indigestible things digestible. Fermented foods are, in measurable nutritional terms, frequently more valuable than their raw ingredients. Your ancestors weren't drinking beer because they were fun-loving. They were drinking beer because they were engineering their food supply. Kimchi, sauerkraut, miso, kefir, sourdough bread, cheese, yogurt, vinegar, fish sauce, injera. The entire global tradition of fermented foods is a survival library. Every culture on Earth independently arrived at fermentation because it solved real, life-threatening problems. The flavors we love, the foods that define every cuisine on Earth, are the legacy of thousands of years of humans figuring out how to not die in winter. Modern gut research has now established that fermented foods actively shape the microbiome in ways that cascade into immune function, mental health, inflammatory response, and metabolic health. Once again, with characteristic reliability, ancient humans were ahead of the curve. They didn't know why it worked. They knew that it worked, and that was enough.